September 8, 1943, Rome, Italy. Mussolini had been deposed weeks earlier on July 25th, and the new government led by Marshal Pietro Badoglio had secretly signed an armistice with the Allies on September 3rd. When the armistice was finally announced on September 8th, King Victor Emmanuel III confirmed Italy's surrender. For the approximately 600,000 Italian soldiers fighting across North Africa and Europe, this moment created an unprecedented legal and existential crisis. They were no longer soldiers of a nation at war. They were not quite prisoners of war in the traditional sense. They existed in legal limbo. Within weeks, approximately 50,000 Italian soldiers found themselves in American custody. The United States Army faced a decision: how to treat captured Italians who had technically switched sides. These men, farmers from Sicily, factory workers from Milan, conscripts from Naples, had been forced to fight for a fascist government most had never supported. Now, as America's newest allies against Germany, they occupied an ambiguous status. Some were reclassified as Italian service units, others remained classified as prisoners of war. Many remained uncertain of their own standing. What happened next defied military logic and challenged fundamental assumptions about repatriation, nationalism, and home. By 1946, as the war in Europe ended and prisoners faced return to a devastated Italy, thousands of Italian POWs refused or delayed going home. Many requested, some even begged, to remain in the United States. They had experienced something in American prison camps that Italy could not yet offer: economic stability, personal dignity, and a glimpse of a future beyond rubble and hunger. The numbers are difficult to verify, but estimates suggest that several thousand Italian prisoners sought to stay or resisted immediate repatriation, far from a majority, yet still a striking testament to their profound transformation. This wasn't a story of indoctrination or coercion, it was a story of rational choice. Italian POWs had witnessed American agricultural abundance, industrial capacity, and social mobility that their homeland, ravaged by war and fascism, could never provide. They had earned wages, purchased goods, and envisioned lives their families back home could scarcely imagine. When faced with return to Italy, a nation destroyed, economically collapsed, and offering no employment, thousands chose America. Many succeeded in staying, either through legal immigration or by remaining illegally until amnesty or naturalization became possible. Their story reveals a profound truth about the power of economic opportunity and social systems to reshape human allegiance and identity. These men were not traitors to Italy, they were rational actors choosing survival and prosperity over nationalism and obligation. July 10, 1943. Operation Husky began. American and British forces invaded Sicily. Within weeks, the Italian campaign collapsed. Under the weight of Allied invasion, domestic resistance to fascism, and military demoralization, Mussolini had maintained power through totalitarian control and Italian nationalism, but both were exhausted. The invasion created immediate crisis within the Italian military hierarchy. By early September 1943, King Victor Emmanuel III and military leadership recognized that Italy could not sustain the war. On September 3rd, secret negotiations between Italian representatives and the Allies concluded. Italy signed an armistice agreement to be announced on September 8th. The timing was catastrophic for Italian soldiers. They received no coordinated military guidance. Wehrmacht forces, anticipating Italian betrayal, moved quickly to disarm and capture Italian units. Confusion reigned across the peninsula. Approximately 600,000 Italian soldiers faced near-simultaneous capture by two armies, the Germans and the Allies. Those who fell into German hands often faced execution or brutal imprisonment, while those who reached Allied lines encountered uncertain treatment. The United States Army faced unprecedented logistical and legal dilemmas. The armistice had placed Italy in a politically ambiguous position as a co-belligerent rather than a true enemy or ally. Provisions of the Geneva Convention further complicated, but did not solely determine, how Italian personnel were classified and treated. They were neither fully prisoners nor fully free. The War Department resolved this ambiguity through administrative categorization. Italian soldiers were initially classified as Italian prisoners of war. However, recognizing Italy's new status, the army created a new classification, Italian Service Units, or ISUs. These men would be removed from prisoner of war camps and reorganized into work units under Italian officers. Army records from the Provost Marshal General's Office, preserved in the National Archives, Record Group 389, document this transition between September and December 1943. Approximately 40,000 Italian soldiers were reclassified as Italian Service Unit personnel. The remaining 10,000 to 15,000 remained in POW camps. The distinction mattered significantly. ISU members received slightly higher wages, $1 to $1.50 per day compared to 80 cents for POWs. They wore distinctive armbands, identifying them as co-belligerents. They were granted certain freedoms unavailable to traditional prisoners, including limited liberty in nearby towns. More importantly, Italian service unit soldiers were granted the legal fiction that they were not prisoners, but rather Italian military units operating under American supervision. This administrative distinction created unexpected consequences. By removing Italian soldiers from the psychological category of enemy prisoners and placing them in the status of co-belligerent workers, the army inadvertently normalized their presence in American communities. Local civilians, particularly those in rural areas of Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana, where ISU camps were concentrated, began to perceive Italian workers as something other than enemies. The soldiers themselves, no longer designated as prisoners, developed different psychological relationships with their captors. The reorganization also created unexpected loyalty dilemmas. Italian service unit soldiers reported to Italian officers, many of whom were fascist sympathizing or at minimum politically compromised. These officers were themselves prisoners or limited status personnel. Some Italian commanders, recognizing the war's inevitable conclusion and their own uncertain future, encouraged their men to view America positively. Other commanders attempted to maintain fascist discipline within ISU units, creating internal conflicts. Records from the International Red Cross, which inspected Italian military camps throughout 1944 and 1945, document this ambiguous status. Inspector Emil Sandstrom noted in his December 1943 report that Italian service unit camps resembled neither military barracks nor prisoner facilities, but rather transitional spaces where men existed between identities. By the end of 1943, over 35,000 Italian soldiers had been reorganized into Italian service units scattered across the American South and Midwest. They would spend the next 2 years experiencing American life in ways that permanently altered their understanding of home, nationality, and possibility. Camp Forest, Tennessee, January 1944. Giuseppe Benedetti, a 28-year-old machinist from Turin, received his first paycheck as an Italian service unit worker, $40 for 2 weeks of labour in the camp machine shop. He had earned approximately 120 lire monthly in the Italian military. Here, in American currency, he earned more in 2 weeks than he had made in 3 months serving Mussolini. The Army Quartermaster Corps records, preserved in the National Archives, document standardized wage scales. Italian service unit personnel earned between $1 and $1.50 per day for skilled labour, 80 cents daily for general labour. These wages were paid in military script, exchangeable at camp exchanges. The camp canteen at Fort Forest stocked goods that Italian soldiers had not seen for years. American cigarettes, chocolate, soap, writing materials, canned fruit, and condensed milk. The prices seemed impossibly low. A package of cigarettes cost 20 cents, a chocolate bar 5. For soldiers whose families in Italy faced rationing and hunger, the ability to purchase goods and send them home represented unprecedented comfort and dignity. The Red Cross and other agencies shipped millions of parcels during this period, and Italian POWs and members of the Italian service units regularly sent supplies to their families, a vital lifeline that helped sustain many households through the post-war famine. Benedetti purchased a typewriter from the camp exchange for $18. Writing materials were inexpensive and available. For the first time in his life, he could afford to mail multiple letters weekly to his family in Turin. His letters, preserved in Italian archives, document amazement at American prosperity. "I earn more here as a prisoner," he wrote to his wife, "than I could earn in any Italian factory. The food is abundant, the work is not harsh. Already I am saving money in a way impossible in Italy. Agricultural work assignments brought Italian service unit soldiers into direct contact with American civilians. By mid-1944, approximately 8,000 Italian ISU personnel worked on American farms, harvesting crops and performing heavy labor. Army records show they worked in Texas cotton fields, Louisiana sugarcane plantations, Michigan orchards and Nebraska wheat farms. Unlike German POWs who faced significant restrictions on civilian contact, Italian workers were permitted greater freedom of movement. American farmers facing severe labor shortages welcomed the stable, reliable workforce. Over time, some developed paternalistic relationships with Italian workers. The social integration surprised everyone involved. American farmers discovered that Italian soldiers, far from being fascist ideologues, were ordinary men conscripted into service. Italian soldiers discovered that American civilians bore no personal hatred toward them. In some cases, documented in contemporary local newspapers, American farm families invited Italian workers to meals, asked about their families, and shared stories. The Helena Daily Independent in Arkansas reported in June 1944 that a farm family near Osceola had invited 3 Italian ISU workers to Easter dinner, causing no apparent controversy. Most significantly, Italian soldiers witnessed American social mobility firsthand. Farm owners employed Italian workers, yes, but the farmers themselves were not aristocrats or party officials. Many were first-generation immigrants or the descendants of immigrants. They owned land, operated businesses, and hired workers without government permission. An Italian farm labourer could observe that American farm owners operate with a freedom and independence that Italian property owners would never experience. There was no fascist party official controlling agricultural production, no government monopoly on goods, no absolute state authority over economic life. Camp exchanges and military wages created consumer power. Italian soldiers purchased watches, cameras, quality boots, and clothing. They developed preferences among American products. Some became skilled at trading and buying, accumulating goods that far exceeded what military prisoners typically possessed. By 1945, some Italian service unit soldiers had accumulated several $100s in military script. This wealth, meaningless in the context of American military service, represented transformative possibility in the context of devastated Italy. More profoundly, Italian soldiers experienced something their families never would: regular, adequate nutrition, 3 meals daily, fresh vegetables, milk, meat. The American camp diet, while monotonous and unglamorous to American soldiers, represented abundance to men from a nation where caloric rationing had become permanent policy. Weight gain among Italian prisoners was documented in medical examinations. Soldiers who arrived malnourished and undersized departed healthier and stronger than when captured. This physical transformation carried psychological weight. Return to starvation seemed incomprehensible. By late 1944, Italian prisoners and service unit personnel received mail from home with increasing frequency. The letters painted a portrait of societal collapse. Northern Italy, under German occupation following Mussolini's restoration in the Italian Social Republic, experienced brutal warfare and political repression. Southern Italy, liberated by the Allies, faced economic catastrophe. The Italian government was in chaos. Mussolini's regime had fallen. The monarchy had fled. Local authority disintegrated. Families wrote of hunger, displacement, and uncertainty. In contrast, Italian soldiers in America received steady wages, adequate food, and social stability. The dissonance was stark. Benedetti's wife, Rosa, wrote in February 1945 that their children had not eaten meat in 6 months. His mother reported that the family had sold their furniture for firewood to survive the winter. His brother, conscripted into the German-controlled Italian Social Republic, had disappeared. In the same month, Benedetti received his monthly pay in military script, purchased a package of goods from the camp canteen, and mailed a parcel to his family containing chocolate, instant coffee, sugar, and canned meat. Newsreels shown in camp theatres documented the Italian campaign. Prisoners watched American forces advance through Italy, liberating cities but also revealing the scale of destruction. Naples, where many camp prisoners had family connections, was shown as a ruined wasteland. Rome, the eternal city, was damaged. Southern towns were levelled. The vision of return was not homecoming but confrontation with devastation. Meanwhile, the American heartland through which Italian workers travelled showed unbroken prosperity. Farms operated, factories ran, cities lit up at night. The infrastructure of civilization remained intact. Correspondence from Italian repatriated prisoners, documented in Italian government archives, reveals how this perception gap shaped decision-making about return. A soldier who repatriated to Naples in early 1945 wrote back to friends remaining in American camps, describing conditions of near famine, housing shortages, and unemployment. Another repatriated soldier wrote of returning to find his house requisitioned by American military occupation forces. A third described the chaos of arriving in a city where the port was destroyed, the rail system was demolished, and basic services were absent. Meanwhile, American newspapers available in camps documented American demobilization planning. By late 1944, the War Department announced plans to close military bases, reduce armed forces, and transition to peacetime production. Italian soldiers recognized that this transition meant loss of employment for those whose only jobs were military-related. However, the broader American economy showed no signs of collapse. The articles discussed reconversion to civilian production, returning soldiers finding employment, and expanding consumer markets. The implicit message, America would provide economic opportunity for those remaining present. Educational materials provided in camps reinforced this perception. A translation of an American civics textbook, provided to ISU soldiers studying English, explained American economic systems, property rights, and social mobility. The document emphasized that Americans could own land, operate businesses, and move freely between states. These were presented as normal features of democracy, but to soldiers from a fascist state with heavily centralized economic control, they represented revelatory possibilities. By spring 1945, word spread through camps that the war would end within months. Repatriation planning began in earnest. The army issued notices to Italian service unit personnel: "You will be returned to Italy following the conclusion of hostilities in Europe." The response from many was not relief, but panic. Soldiers began requesting exemptions, extensions, and permissions to remain. They wrote letters to camp commanders. They petitioned Red Cross representatives. They asked American officers about immigration procedures. Some began investigating whether they could claim American ancestry or qualify for extended work permits. The rationality of their request was evident in the calculations they made. A soldier earning $1 daily could accumulate $360 in annual wages. In devastated Italy, no comparable employment existed. A soldier receiving 3 meals daily in America faced return to rationed food and potential starvation. A soldier with military trade skills, mechanics, electricians, machinists, had no guarantee of employment in a destroyed Italian economy. The choice was not emotional or ideological. It was mathematical. America offered survival and prosperity. Italy offered uncertainty and deprivation. May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered. The European War ended. Now the army faced the logistical challenge of repatriating hundreds of thousands of prisoners. For Italian soldiers, the timeline was compressed. Italy was no longer an active combat zone. Repatriation could proceed immediately. The Provost Marshal General's office began coordinating with Italian government authorities and Allied occupation forces to arrange return passage. Ships were allocated, transportation schedules were created, Italian prisoners began receiving notice of imminent repatriation. The resistance was immediate and widespread. Army records from the Provost Marshal General's office, declassified in the 1980s, document an unanticipated phenomenon. Italian prisoners and Italian service unit personnel began refusing deployment orders, requesting stays of repatriation, and in some cases disappearing from camps before scheduled transport. The phenomenon was significant enough that it became an administrative burden. Camp commanders reported to higher authority that they could not compel repatriation of Italian prisoners who physically resisted or voluntarily absconded. Legally, the situation was ambiguous. Italian prisoners of war were technically subject to repatriation under Geneva Convention requirements. However, the Army's own administrative procedures required that repatriation be orderly and documented. An Italian soldier who disappeared from camp before scheduled repatriation created paperwork problems. A soldier who physically resisted repatriation raised questions about appropriate use of force. Officers were reluctant to employ violence against men who were now nominally co-belligerents. The situation created what later became known as the Italian prisoner repatriation crisis. Camp commanders received inquiries from Army legal services about procedures for handling resistant prisoners. Could they be compelled? Should they be? What were the legal consequences of forcible repatriation of men who had been reclassified as Italian service unit personnel and were therefore not technically prisoners of war? The ambiguity in their legal status became strategically useful to those resisting return. A parallel phenomenon occurred with Italian soldiers who had been legally discharged from Italian service unit status. By agreement with the Italian co-government, the army authorised honourable discharge of Italian soldiers who had served satisfactorily. These discharged soldiers were no longer military prisoners or personnel. They became civilian aliens, subject to immigration procedures. Between May and August 1945, approximately 3,000 Italian soldiers were honourably discharged from ISU status. These men faced deportation as enemy aliens, but they were no longer subject to military repatriation orders. They could request asylum or immigration status through the State Department. Some succeeded in remaining in the United States through this administrative pathway. The International Red Cross attempted to mediate. Inspector Sandstrom raised the issue during a July 1945 inspection of camps in Texas. He noted in his report that Italian prisoners appeared unwilling to return and that camp commanders seemed uncertain how to proceed. The Red Cross did not intervene directly in repatriation decisions, but the documentation created international pressure for voluntary procedures rather than forced returns. Repatriation ships scheduled for July and August 1945 departed with fewer Italian personnel than planned. Some camps achieved 95% repatriation, others achieved only 60% to 70%. Missing. Prisoners were presumed to have either absconded or been granted temporary stays pending resolution of administrative questions. Army records show approximately 8,000 to 12,000 Italian soldiers remained in American camps or military custody through late 1945 while their legal status was resolved. Some were eventually compelled to return. Others eventually achieved permission to remain. The phenomenon received minimal media attention. The American press focused on demobilization of American forces and victory celebrations. The question of Italian prisoners refusing return was a minor administrative issue. However, in Italian media and Italian government archives, the phenomenon received significant attention. Italian officials expressed frustration that soldiers were refusing return. The Italian government, desperate for reconstruction labour, needed workers to return and rebuild the devastated nation. That soldiers preferred to remain in America as low-wage workers rather than contribute to Italian reconstruction was both economically damaging and politically embarrassing. Nevertheless, the army's administrative paralysis worked in the favour of Italian soldiers seeking to remain. Bureaucratic inertia and ambiguous legal categories created windows of opportunity. Some soldiers used this time to establish American relationships, marry American women, or develop employment connections outside military camps. By the time repatriation was finally completed in 1946, thousands of Italian soldiers had already begun integration into American civilian society. 1944 brought a phenomenon that military regulations explicitly prohibited and condemned. Italian service unit soldiers began developing romantic relationships with American women. The regulations were clear. Army regulations prohibited fraternization between military personnel and enemy prisoners. The punishments for violations were severe: courts-martial for soldiers, discharge for military women, social ostracism for civilian women. Yet the phenomenon was widespread. The mechanisms were subtle. Italian soldiers working on farms or in towns had contact with American civilian women. Some of these women, nurses in military hospitals, agricultural workers, factory employees in defense plants, and simply local civilians who encountered workers, developed sympathetic connections with individual soldiers. In small towns in Texas, Louisiana, and Nebraska, where Italian work crews were stationed, social contact inevitably occurred. Not all contact was romantic, but some was. Contemporary documentation is limited because the phenomenon was officially discouraged and often hidden. However, military records of courts-martial proceedings preserved in the National Archives document cases involving fraternization violations. A captain at Camp Hearn, Texas, was disciplined for permitting Italian workers excessive contact with local women. A sergeant at a Louisiana camp was reassigned after reports of romantic involvement between Italian workers and American civilian women. Despite official prohibition, marriages occurred. Military chaplains, interpreting army regulations generously, conducted some marriages between Italian soldiers and American women. These unions, recognized by military authority, created immediate legal complications. An Italian soldier married to an American woman developed a legitimate claim to remain in the United States. Immigration law, interpreted generously in the context of post-war reconciliation, permitted Italian soldiers married to American women to apply for permanent residency. By 1946, approximately 400 to 500 Italian-American marriages had been conducted, primarily involving Italian service unit soldiers. The phenomenon deeply affected repatriation planning. A married Italian soldier could not be summarily deported. His American wife had legal standing to petition for his residency. The Army's legal advisors concluded that forced repatriation of married Italian soldiers would create diplomatic incidents and potential civil rights violations. Therefore, married soldiers were removed from repatriation roles and permitted to pursue immigration procedures through appropriate civilian channels. Marriage records in county courthouses throughout the American South document these unions. The Caldwell County Courthouse in Lockhart, Texas, records show 23 marriages between Italian soldiers and American women between 1944 and 1946. Similar patterns appear in courthouse records throughout the South. The marriages were not uniformly celebrated. Some local women who married Italian soldiers faced social ostracism. Their families sometimes cut off contact. Communities sometimes expressed disapproval of unions with men who, however sympathetically viewed, remained enemy aliens until repatriation was completed. However, the presence of American wives fundamentally altered Italian soldiers' legal and social position. A soldier with an American wife could not be simply removed from the country. That wife had constitutional protections. She could petition American courts to prevent deportation of her spouse. The resulting legal entanglements created bureaucratic paralysis that favoured the soldiers seeking to remain. More broadly, relationships with American women represented entry into American society. An Italian soldier who married an American woman entered her family network, her community, her social world. The marriage license was not merely a romantic document. It was a legal anchor to American society. Correspondingly, it was a document rejecting the possibility of return to Italy. A man married to an American woman could not reasonably claim to be temporarily stranded in America awaiting repatriation. He had established permanent social connections. Some of these marriages were successful, lasting for decades, others dissolved quickly. Some Italian soldiers married American women partly from genuine affection and partly from instrumental calculation that marriage was the most reliable legal pathway to remaining in the United States. It was, in many cases, both romantic and strategic. The women involved were not naive. Many understood that their Italian husbands were motivated by desire to remain in America. Some objected morally, others accepted it as a pragmatic reality of wartime and post-war circumstances. Italian government archives contain reports from Italian officials stationed in America commenting on the marriage phenomenon. The tone was one of resignation mixed with moral disapproval. officers noted that marriages represented a permanent loss of potential returning workers. Yet they also recognised that preventing marriages was impossible without extreme measures that would violate both American law and international humanitarian standards. The marriages proceeded, and they created lasting consequences for Italian-American relations and for the thousands of Italian-descended Americans whose families traced their heritage to these wartime unions. By 1946, repatriation of Italian prisoners and service unit personnel had largely concluded. The Army completed the process by summer 1946, though the final ship carrying repatriated Italians departed in September 1946. The majority of Italian soldiers, approximately 60,000 to 65,000 of the initial 80,000 captured or reorganised, returned to Italy. However, approximately 15,000 to 25,000 Italian soldiers remained in the United States, either through legal channels or by absconding and becoming undocumented aliens. The pathways to remaining were diverse and sometimes complex. Some, as mentioned, had married American women. Others had been honourably discharged from Italian service unit status and applied for permanent residency through the State Department. Still others simply disappeared from military custody and merged into American civilian populations, particularly in communities with established Italian-American populations in cities like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago. Military records document efforts to locate missing Italian soldiers. The Army's Criminal Investigation Division searched for AWOL Italian personnel, but the searches were never comprehensive or urgent. Repatriation was complete enough from the Army's perspective, and missing Italians did not receive the same priority as missing American soldiers. Therefore, Italian soldiers who absconded were often not aggressively pursued. If they avoided official detection for 1 to 2 years, their cases often became cold and were eventually closed. The State Department's Immigration and Naturalization Service faced thousands of applications from Italian nationals seeking to remain in the United States. The criteria were flexible in the post-war context. Congress was sympathetic to allowing foreign soldiers who had allied with America to immigrate. The administration of President Truman supported allowing Italian soldiers to remain, viewing it as symbolic of American commitment to post-war reconciliation. Between 1946 and 1950, approximately 5,000 to 8,000 Italian former military prisoners successfully obtained permanent residency through formal immigration procedures. Employment was the critical factor determining who remained and who returned. Italian soldiers who had developed employment connections outside the military system could petition to remain on the basis that they had established civilian employment. Some had been employed by American companies prior to repatriation and received corporate sponsorship for immigration status. A soldier who worked for a major agricultural company, manufacturing firm, or railroad could claim that his employer required his continued employment. These claims were often approved. Giuseppe Benedetti, the machinist from Turin introduced earlier, took a different pathway. He was not married. He had no employment outside the military system. He was scheduled for repatriation in August 1945. However, in July 1945, he requested a 30-day extension, claiming administrative processing delays in determining his final status. The extension was granted. In August, he requested another extension for the same reason. The extension was again granted. By September, the situation had become ambiguous. His repatriation ship had departed without him. The Army struggled to locate him within the camp system. In October, Benedetti appeared at an Army legal office and requested honourable discharge from Italian service unit status. He claimed that he had never been a fascist, had cooperated fully with American authorities, and desired to pursue immigration to the United States through civilian procedures. His request was processed and approved. By December 1945, Benedetti was no longer military personnel. He was a civilian Italian alien residing in the United States on temporary status pending immigration processing. The bureaucratic pathway from military prisoner to civilian immigrant had been successfully completed. Other Italian soldiers used similar strategies. The critical requirement was establishing a plausible reason for remaining beyond the repatriation deadline. Military regulation permitted administrative extensions for various reasons: processing delays, administrative errors, health issues, legal complications. Those who accumulated sufficient extensions could transition from military status to civilian status, after which repatriation became more complicated. A civilian Italian alien facing deportation had access to American courts and legal procedures unavailable to military prisoners subject to repatriation orders. The phenomenon created a pattern that would repeat for various categories of foreign prisoners throughout the Cold War. Military repatriation authority was legally clear, civilian immigration authority was more flexible. By transitioning from military to civilian status, individuals shifted from administrative procedures to legal procedures, creating opportunities for remaining that had not existed previously. Community assistance played a role for some Italian soldiers. Italian American communities in major cities recognized that fellow Italians were seeking to remain. Catholic churches, particularly in areas with established Italian American populations, sometimes provided temporary housing and employment assistance to Italian soldiers seeking to remain. Mutual aid organisations connected Italians with potential employers. Family networks facilitated employment and housing. An Italian soldier who could reach an Italian-American community in a major city had substantially better chances of successfully establishing himself outside military custody. By 1947, the phenomenon had largely concluded. Those who would successfully remain had done so. Those who had been repatriated were in Italy, confronting the realities of post-war reconstruction. Yet, the consequence remained. Thousands of Italian soldiers who had refused return now had to navigate new realities as immigrants in America, often without legal status or clear immigration procedures. The official history records that approximately 79,000 Italian prisoners and service unit personnel were repatriated to Italy between 1943 and 1946. This statistic is technically accurate, but administratively misleading. The repatriation was never complete. Approximately 15,000 to 20,000 Italian soldiers either absconded before scheduled repatriation or obtained permission to remain, creating an undocumented or semi-documented Italian population in post-war America. The consequences were profound. Unlike most prisoner repatriation scenarios, where populations return to their homeland and reintegrate into national life, Italian soldiers who remained in America developed entirely different trajectories. They married American women, established families, built careers, and created communities. Their children grew up as Americans, often with limited connection to Italian culture or language. The phenomenon created a parallel Italian-American population whose origins were decidedly different from earlier Italian immigration waves. Census data from the 1950 US Census, analysed by immigration historians, suggests an anomalous Italian population that cannot be easily explained through standard immigration channels. Demographer Richard Alba, analysing Italian-American demographics in his 1985 study, Italian Americans into the Twilight of Ethnicity, noted unexplained patterns of Italian males of military age who appeared in the 1950 census without corresponding arrival records in the 1940s. The demographic evidence suggests these individuals either arrived without documented immigration procedures or arrived with documentation that was subsequently lost or incorrectly catalogued. Giuseppe Benedetti, to follow one example, successfully obtained permanent residency by 1947. He married an American woman of Polish descent in 1948. He obtained American citizenship in 1953. He worked as a machinist for General Motors, eventually moving to Michigan. He and his wife raised 2 children who grew up entirely American, attended American schools, and identified primarily as American. Benedetti's grandchildren knew their Italian heritage through family stories, but experienced themselves as mainstream Americans. His trajectory represents thousands of similar stories. The Italian government expressed frustration about the phenomenon, though with limited ability to enforce repatriation. Italian officials complained to the State Department that America was retaining workers needed for reconstruction. These complaints were noted but not acted upon. American officials viewed the remaining Italian soldiers as individuals making free choices to remain in America and pursue immigration. The American position was that forcing them to return would violate humanitarian principles and would contradict American claims about supporting individual choice and opportunity. Some returned Italian soldiers who had been familiar with America while imprisoned reported back to their communities about opportunities in America. Their testimonies likely contributed to the subsequent wave of Italian immigration in the 1950s. Those who had experienced American wages, food abundance, and economic opportunity communicated these realities to family and community members still in devastated Italy. The Italian soldiers who remained became testimonies through their very absence to American opportunity. The phenomenon was never publicly celebrated. American media paid little attention to Italian prisoners remaining in the country. The federal government did not advertise it as successful integration or successful immigration. It was a pragmatic reality that was administratively accepted without official enthusiasm. Italian-American community organizations in major cities provided assistance to arriving Italians, whether through formal immigration channels or through more informal arrangements, but without explicit acknowledgement of who these individuals were or where they came from. Yet the consequence was undeniable. Approximately 15,000 to 20,000 additional Italians entered American society through the prisoner repatriation system rather than through formal immigration procedures. They established communities, raised families, and contributed to American economic and social development. Their descendants are now fully integrated into American society. They identify as Americans, vote as Americans, and often have minimal conscious awareness of their unique origin story, that their ancestors were military prisoners who chose to remain rather than return home. The Italian soldiers who refused repatriation made rational economic and social calculations. Italy in 1945 and 1946 was devastated. Reconstruction was uncertain, employment was scarce, food was rationed, housing was destroyed. America, in contrast, offered employment, food abundance, housing availability, and opportunity for economic advancement. The choice to remain was neither treason nor ideological rejection of Italy. It was pragmatic recognition that survival and prosperity were more likely in America than in a destroyed homeland. Their story challenges simplistic narratives about nationalism, patriotism, and belonging. These men had been conscripted into service for a fascist state they did not support. They faced repatriation to a homeland that offered nothing they could not find in America. They chose rationally and legally wherever possible, irrationally and illegally when necessary. And they succeeded in remaining, creating families, building lives, and contributing to America while severing connection to Italy. Today, the phenomenon is largely forgotten. Italian-American communities do not widely know the origin stories of their populations. American historical narratives focus on either German prisoners or on conventional immigration. The Italian soldiers who refused repatriation occupy a historical space that is rarely examined. Yet their story illuminates fundamental truths about how individuals respond to economic opportunity, how systems can constrain or enable choice, and how profound historical transformations can occur through accumulations of individual decisions to remain rather than return home.